Daniel 3 tells us the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, three Jewish young men who were exiled into Babylon from Jerusalem. The story about them is so unbelievably dramatic and traumatic that it's hard to believe. But the story is in the Bible and it's true. These three young men were scholars and they were faithful to God and they loved God. And King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon trusted their opinions. And they were buddies with Daniel, the one thrown into the lion's den. King Nebuchadnezzar built a golden statue that was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. It was huge, and it was commanded and required that at the sound of all these musical instruments, everybody had to bow down and worship this statue. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to the statue because the only God they would bow down to is our God of Abraham, the God we love and worship. We wouldn't bow down and worship any other God, or would we? If our lives were put on the line to either bow down to a statue or be thrown into a fiery furnace and be burnt alive, would you bow down to this statue? I mean, it would be very, very difficult for us not to bow down, don't you think? And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, no, they will not worship this golden statue. And so the order of King Nebuchadnezzar was, if someone does not bow down when they hear these musical instruments, they would immediately be thrown into a fiery furnace. So when it was found out that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down at the sound of that music, Chaldeans, who hated these young Jewish men, they came and they told King Nebuchadnezzar that they broke the law, and so they must be punished. It is required that they be punished and thrown into the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar was so mad, he told his men to turn up the heat 7 times hotter than it already was. And then he had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bound. They were wearing their robes, they were wearing their hats, they were wearing all of their clothes, and they were bound. The fiery furnace was so hot that King Nebuchadnezzar's men died just from the fumes of the heat. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, and they fell down. The Bible states that they fell down into the fiery furnace. And the way the scriptures are written, the original text, when it says they fell down, it means that they basically kneeled down to worship. It's the type of falling down when you fall down to worship God. That's the type of falling down that they did into the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fiery furnace, and instead of seeing absolutely nothing, because these 3 men would have been totally incinerated in this fire, he saw 4 men walking around the furnace, loosed. They were bound when they were thrown in, but now they were loose. They were walking around, and instead of just the 3 of them, King Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 men. Who was that 4th man? We know it was Jesus. Before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the furnace, King Nebuchadnezzar said, who can deliver you from me, from incinerating you in the furnace? What kind of God can do that? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that God was able to save them from this fiery death. But they also knew that if God didn't want to save them, if maybe it was in his plan, that is what God would do. But they trusted God. They knew God was able to save them. And so that's why they allowed themselves to be thrown into this furnace instead of disobeying God and bowing down to that golden statue. So when Nebuchadnezzar saw these 4 men in the furnace, he called out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he said, "Come hither to me so I can talk to you." And they walked out of the fiery furnace. The Bible tells us that the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar spake about our God, that there is no higher God than the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is a true story. This really happened. These men were brave enough to risk their lives for God, not disobeying him, not falling down to worship a golden image because they trust God. Are we living an uncompromised life for God, walking on the path of righteousness? Do we believe in our Savior Jesus Christ enough to trust him in all things with our lives? God bless you.